How's it going, everybody? My name is Parks Gore, and today we're going to be reviewing William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. Okay, this comes on the heels of my other comparative religion book review, and that was James George Fraser's The Golden Bow. So obviously, I've been on a comparative religion kick lately, and whereas The Golden Bow primarily focused on magic, superstition, and ritual and religious systems that arise from magic and superstition, this book is not so much focused on that. This book it has an explicitly stated goal by James of trying to found a sort of religion, not religion, a science of religion, not a religion of science. Well, at the end of the day, they might be the same thing. We'll see, though. I'll let you be the judge. The goal here is we're not going to be looking at the average believer or even the primitive believer. The goal here with the Varieties of Religious Experience is to look at the religious experiences of people who could be termed geniuses of religion, right? So people with an exceedingly high intellect who had some sort of intense religious experience, some sort of conversion, and wrote about these experiences. And the goal here with this book is to kind of dissect the psychology behind the religious experience. It is very much a empirically driven sort of a book. And to give you a little background on the author, so the author, William James, he was a professor at Harvard of psychology. And this is during the 20th century. This book was published in, I think, 1910. William James was thought to be one of the sort of founding fathers of modern psychology. And this book is actually a collection of his lectures, or the book was written to be a sort of lecture series. And the lecture series, the goal of it is to essentially look at the religious experience and to draw a sort of existential judgment about this religious experience, and then through the drawing of the existential judgment, try to draw out some sort of value judgment. What really are the value of these experiences? And James is pretty explicit in the beginning. So to draw an existential judgment, which is essentially to ask, what are the nature of these experiences? How can we identify them? What is the psychology of the people who are experiencing them? What are the effects of this experience? That's one thing, right? That can be sort of scientifically measured. That can be cataloged. That's easier. But to determine the value of these experiences, right, or the fruit, that's a little bit more difficult. That's a question that science can't necessarily answer. That's getting into the realm of philosophy. And so, essentially, this is what James is setting out to do. And like I said, the method that he employs to do this is to essentially look at writings from pretty much people from the medieval period onward and try to see if there's a common thread through all of these experiences. There's a trouble with determining the fruit or the value of these experiences based on existential judgments alone. And he acknowledges this in the beginning. So he says, for example, whereas most scientists or materialists have attempted to determine the value of these experiences based on their origin, William James sees this as a mistake. So whereas in the past, scientists have said, oh, the religious impulse, this can be explained by a certain condition of the liver or, a person having epilepsy, and that's why this person is having mystical visions. That's why this person is believing these things or acting in these sorts of ways. And therefore, we can write off the religious phenomenon. We can write off the religious impulse as sort of a biologically determined thing. William James, I really appreciate this. From the get-go, he says, if these beliefs are biologically determined, which he's not beyond suggesting that, right? Because he's a scientist first and foremost. He says if they are biologically determined, and so because of that we can write them off as, useless, then is not the scientific worldview also itself biologically determined, right? So if St. Paul, being an epileptic, caused him to believe Christianity, and then we can write off Christianity, would not the condition of a person's liver affecting their views of science or something like that, would that not also be grounds to write off the scientific materialist worldview? And so he draws this very early on. We cannot determine the value. We can't judge the value of a belief based on its existential facts, right? That it has to come from somewhere else entirely. And so I appreciate this. I feel like in this work, he's working with a bit more self-awareness than Fraser. So Fraser, in the previous review, he kind of was talking about the superstitions of these primitive peoples, and he essentially wrote off a lot of the things that they believed and a lot of things they did as foolish, right? Because it's arising from superstition. And, he's sort of saying, well, we don't have to believe in magic and religion anymore because we have science, right? Science is something we know we can trust in. James is obviously a little bit more self-aware with this. Now, I think his self-awareness is not totally all-encompassing, because I do think he hits a limit with this toward the end of the work, and we'll get into that later. But I do at least appreciate that he's not willing to write off the religious impulse entirely. A lot of people get angry at somebody like Jordan Peterson because Jordan Peterson does a very similar sort of move. And I wouldn't be surprised if, while I was reading this, I kind of felt I got the sense that Jordan Peterson has definitely read this work, and it probably deeply influenced him, because it's taking a scientific look at religion, and it's trying to draw out the meaning of these experiences and the value of them. And the thing that's frustrating to many people about Jordan Peterson is he does this move where he's not willing to dispose of religion entirely, because he sees that there is some value in it, but he's not willing to commit to any dogma either. And a lot of people, both on the non-religious side and on the religious side, are frustrated at this because they wish he would just commit to one side or the other. But the main thing here is James admits that science cannot possibly tell us what the value or the meaning of these experiences are, right? His thesis in the beginning essentially seems to be that, yes, science can provide us some empirical resources. It can tell us a little bit about our environment as far as we can understand it. But it can't tell us about things like morality. It cannot tell us about things like our place in the universe, what we ought to be doing, right? It gets back to that problem David Hume rose. So David Hume, he was a skeptic. He essentially discovered that you cannot get an is from an ought, right? I can look at the universe around me. I can perfectly explain everything that's happening, and I can perfectly articulate everything that I see and everything that I observe. None of that tells me how I actually should act in the world, how I should go about my life, what I ought to do, right? So science cannot tell us morally how to act. And so James essentially says that the value of religion is it essentially picks up where science has to leave off. Science has to leave off at these questions that are unanswerable. And religion is essentially picking it up from there and trying to find those answers, or positing answers to those questions that, in a sense, are unanswerable. But science or religion is providing a hypothesis of sorts, right? And so one of the most useful distinctions that he makes in this book, because he has a very large focus on the feeling aspect of religion, right? He does not get into the theology aspect. He does not get into the cultural aspect or the institutional aspect of religion. He's very much preoccupied with the feeling aspect of it. And it's because he's looking at individual experiences, right? And so the main thing here, one of the most useful distinctions that I actually drew out of this book is the distinction between the healthy-minded religious individual and the sick soul religious individual. So these types, the main distinction between these types is essentially how they view evil, right? So the healthy-minded they are also typically called the once-born or the twice-born. So the once-born is the healthy-minded, the twice-born is the sick soul. And like I said, the main distinction here is how they view evil. So the healthy-minded person, or the once-born person, they essentially live and construct their theology in these terms. Evil, insofar as it exists, is sort of best left ignored or minimized, right? If it exists, it can't be helped. And so there's no use focusing on sin or misfortune or any of these things. We ought to, in the words of the Bible, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? This is a very cynical viewpoint of the person who essentially says this life is all that there is. We need to make use of it. Or this life, we don't know if there's a next life. We don't know. And so we ought to just make use of this life, as we see it or as we have it. In fact, these types tend to assert even to focus on evil, right? To dwell on it, to weep, to mourn, to repent. All of these are states that increase suffering. And so they're no use, right? This is a view of the healthy-minded individual. And in another case, they may even consider evil as something purely subjective. So a lot of times you've heard people say, it all depends on how you look at it, man. Dude, it all depends on how you look at it, man. Oh yeah, you think that, I don't know, you think that robbery is evil? Well, what if that person's trying to feed their family? It's all subjective, man. Evil is subjective. And so they're very much, they're relativists in some cases, but obviously we can't we can't generalize too much about this psychological type, as you'll see later. And the reason why is because there's a broad range of folks and there's a broad range of viewpoints even within this psychological type, right? We have materialists like Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Friedrich Nietzsche, and we even have spiritualists of this type, right? We have progressive Christians, right? We have New Agers, Hindus of all types, process theologians, Epicureans. I actually don't know if Epicureans are spiritualists or materialists. There probably is multiple camps of those, but the idea with most of these types is we don't really need to pay too much attention to evil. We mostly need to focus on the good, and we're best. Our life is best and most meaningful when we just sort of ignore evil altogether. And so they are primarily concerned with pleasure, maintaining happiness, and ignoring or otherwise minimizing evil. And if they do believe in God, they trust wholeheartedly in his, inexhaustible forgiveness and non-judgmentalism. And so they can be best described as having a sort of contentment within finitude, right? They have a contentment with the finite. And James is not wholly uncritical of these types. As a matter of fact, he reports that their optimism, at least to his view, is more than likely feigned, right? It's probably fake. They're probably faking it. They're probably affecting a sort of bravery in the face of reality that is altogether not real. Like they're not as unbothered as they say they are. It's sort of just it's an affect. You're faking it. You're being a poser. You're being a poser essentially, and that's because their strategy is all well and good as long as they are able to effectively ignore evil, right? But as anyone who has lived in the world for any amount of time knows, you can only ignore evil for so long before it is essentially just knocking at your door, or probably more accurately, knocking down your door, right? Evil is kind of an intrinsic part of this worldly existence. And so so the main thing here is they sort of shut their eyes to the suffering of the world, whether it be their own or the suffering of other people. Think about Buddha. So in the story of the Buddha, he essentially is raised in a sort of palace. And in this palace, his father made sure that he would never have any sort of want for anything that he desired, it would be gratified right away. The palace was filled with beautiful things, nothing ugly inside the palace, nothing evil inside the palace. And he was trying to insulate the Buddha from any of the ills of this world. And what do we find in the story of the Buddha? The Buddha gets kind of bored, right? He gets kind of bored with his confinement, and he's like, I want to go and see the world. He goes out in the world, he sees a sick person lying on the ground, and then he's just overwhelmed by this sort of realization that, like, oh my gosh, evil, death, suffering. These things are in the world, and what are we going to do about it? And so Buddha, whereas he kind of got a little bit of that cabin fever. He got a little bit of that cabin fever up in the palace, and he had to get out of there. The same cannot be said for the healthy-minded types. They are perfectly happy, perfectly content with the finite. They're perfectly happy to remain in their palace, sequestered away from all appearances of evil. And so, I could say a lot more about this type. Like I said, this is probably one of the most groundbreaking discoveries that I made while reading this, because as soon as I sort of got an idea for this certain psychological type, I recognize it in a lot of different ideologies and a lot of different theologies out there today. But we have to move on for the sake of time. The next type, the twice born, okay? These people are, from an earthly perspective, they could be considered less fortunate, right, for having this sort of psychological makeup. Because, to them, they are quite contented with the idea that, as our Lord says, blessed are they who mourn, right? So here we have a type that recognizes evil is kind of inevitable. It's unavoidable. And, in its more malignant manifestations, they recognize evil in its more malignant manifestations, but they also make it their mission to lament this evil, to root it out, and to destroy what semblance of that evil they can find within themselves. They lean on God as a healer, and they also fear his wrath, right? They have the fear of God in them. They're working out their salvation with fear and trembling, as the Bible says. They're not sort of resting on this idea that I can pretty much do whatever. I know that God's super forgiving, so I can kind of do whatever I want. There's this super jaded viewpoint now where people say, so Jesus died for my sins, right? So I can just sin like the devil, and on my deathbed I can, just ask for forgiveness and I'll be fine. And this is just such a foolish viewpoint because you can't trick God. But anyways, even the more atheistic instantiations of this viewpoint, this twice-born viewpoint, such as Buddhism, right? A lot of forms of Buddhism don't necessarily believe in any sort of a God or anything like that. Even they recognize suffering to be one of the incontrovertible facts of existence, and they sort of resign themselves to asceticism. What is asceticism? Asceticism is withdrawal. Asceticism is present in many different forms of religion, as James makes clear in his book. Asceticism, saintliness, these are parts of almost all religions, not every single religion practices asceticism, but asceticism is one of the sort of main characteristics that we see across a lot of these world religions. And mostly and only among the twice-born type. Because for the once-born, there's not really a reason for asceticism. There's not really a reason to withdraw from this world if this world is essentially good, right? So the Christians who take... The idea here is like the Christians of this type, of the twice-born type, they take very seriously this idea that the Lord, he says, unless a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God, right? There's this very palpable sense of being born again, being converted. And so, we have a meeting of the two types in actually an anecdote from my personal experience. So, I was listening to a professor some years ago. He was a philosophy professor, and of course, we kind of did a quick breeze through all these different philosophers throughout world history. And Kierkegaard has always been very near and dear to my heart. I've always really loved Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, as anyone who's seen my previous review of Either Or, he's a very, you could say he's a morbid type of philosopher. He was a Christian. He was an existentialist. He's a Protestant Christian. He was very angsty, and he was always sort of wrestling with himself in this idea of the character of God and the facts of life. And in his book, Either Or, he kind of perfectly distinguishes between this healthy-minded type, this once-born type, and the sick soul, or the twice-born type. And so if you haven't checked out that review, go ahead and go check that out. But he calls these types by a different name. He calls the once born, the healthy minded, he calls them the aesthetic man. The aesthetic man. What is aesthetics? Aesthetics is vibes. Aesthetics is beauty. The aesthetic man is primarily concerned with living a beautiful life, getting to live out these sort of fantasies that he's created for himself. His life is sort of an attempt at contentment with the finite. And then the ethical man, he's someone who is kind of preoccupied with self-sacrifice. He is, you could say, the religious man. He is someone who morality is something that he actually values, and he also is not afraid to recognize that evil is not only real but potentially found within himself, and needs rooting out. And so I remember this professor. He was discussing Kierkegaard. I was very excited. The professor, he was a very charismatic guy. He was funny. I quite enjoyed his lectures, and he always had a way of very briefly summarizing a philosopher's personality and their work. And so we're about to have a lecture on Kierkegaard, and I'm so excited for it. And, he quotes Kierkegaard. He quotes, actually, the book Either Or. And the quote goes like this: "Marry and you will regret it. Don't marry and you will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you'll regret it either way. Laugh at the world's foolishness, you will regret it. Weep over it, and you will regret that too. Laugh at the world's foolishness or weep over it, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the essence of philosophy." And immediately upon quoting this, the professor, he turns to the class, he scoffs, and he says, I'll never forget this. He said, "Kierkegaard, buddy, lighten up a little bit. Have a glass of wine. Relax, man." And the class kind of laughed. I did not laugh, because I was like, this philosopher, I identify with this philosopher. I think this philosopher is very deep and worth contending with. His thought is unsettling, but it's worth wrestling with. And this professor, who I liked this professor a lot. But in that moment, I kind of realized, he is doing that sort of Christopher Hitchens thing. Christopher Hitchens, he would get into these debates, atheists versus Christians or whatever. And Christopher Hitchens, a lot of times, would totally ignore whatever argument was being made, and he would kind of make a joke as like an appeal to the audience. And a lot of times the audience would laugh because Christopher Hitchens, he was, kind of somewhat charismatic guy. And then he would get off scot-free. Like, he didn't really have to answer the argument. And so it's kind of an interesting thing here. Like, there's no real contending with what is being said. And so you kind of just brush it off. Once again, the healthy-minded type, their whole strategy is essentially to just try to ignore evil. And it works as long as it works, right? But it's not always going to work, because obviously we all have to meet our maker someday. We all have to, we all have an expiration date. And so in my estimation, this betrays a very serious lack of contending with the subject matter, right? What's ironic is the quote actually comes from that book, Either Or, right? It comes from Kierkegaard's book, Either Or. And the part that he's quoting is actually the either. It's actually the aesthetic man speaking. And it's a lament of the aesthetic man. The aesthetic man is essentially lamenting that he'll not be able to live out all the poetic images of his life that he has sort of crafted for himself. He is not going to be able to live out all of his fantasies, all these images of who he thinks he is or who he hopes himself to be. And so it's kind of ironic here. Like, there's a lot of contradiction in healthy-mindedness. There's a lot of contradiction in this, like, trying to ignore evil, because you end up having to ignore certain parts of yourself, and you kind of it cuts off your ability to sort of become a whole person. And so we have here like proof that the once born and the healthy-minded type is, due to its commitment to always have the laughter on its side, as Kierkegaard says, a sort of ironically tragic figure, right? He does not see that he is self-contradictory. And in his attempt to, he's self-contradictory in his attempt to outrun his own baseness, his own hypocrisy, and his own, ultimately, cowardice in the face of evil. All this might seem like, way too much conflation, right? I'm taking all these different types of personalities and I'm essentially swirling them into one type and saying all these types are essentially one type. And James, in his book, he acknowledges this. He essentially says, yes, there is a huge range of personality types within this broad category of the healthy-minded. But I think that's one of the strengths of this book, is that he's able to take something that's very broad and actually give it explanatory power. Like healthy-mindedness and having and the sick soul or the twice-born, these are very broad types, but also they do a pretty good job at splitting things down the middle, right? It's very good at classifying these essentially two different types of religious experience. And so my view of this, I've talked about it in my review of Kierkegaard's Either Or. My view of the difference between the once born and the twice born, the healthy-minded and the sick soul, is that the one is contained and transcended in the other. So whereas you could say Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the healthy-minded types, Kierkegaard is clearly one of the sick-souled, twice-born types. And in my opinion, even though Nietzsche definitely gets more, airtime, he definitely gets more radio play, Kierkegaard is clearly the deeper thinker, because all the tragedy and all the hope that is contained within Nietzsche is also contained within Kierkegaard and then transcended. Like there's just more. There's more depth there. There's more greatness of soul there, which ironically is what these poetic, healthy-minded, once-born types think that they're kind of striving after. And so in other words, the twice-born type lives the poetic life that the once-born wish that they lived, and also they're more moral, and also through their confrontation with evil have actually found a way through it rather than just ignoring it. They are knights of faith, as Kierkegaard puts it, and they're the noblest sort of human personality. James may not put it in as many words as I do, but he does reiterate again and again that the twice-born type it has a more firm grasp on reality. And because of this, it's a more heroic type. And so what constitutes a conversion from one to the other? What actually, how can we explain conversion in terms of psychology? Essentially, it's very simple. Conversion is the process of feelings and values of marginal attention displacing what was previously at the center of the personality. And so right now, you and I, we have primary concerns. My primary concern right now is getting through with this video before my camera dies, because you guys have no idea how long it took to set up everything in here. It's like the lights were like at 5%. I had to go replace those batteries. The camera was at like 9%. I got a charger right here with backup batteries. And then this Zoom, the audio runs out of AA batteries so quick, right? And so, what was I even saying? Okay, so the main idea here is that the center of attention, is sort of what constitutes the core of a personality, their concerns, their values, their aims, their goals. And then what happens during a conversion is that these concerns and values and places of attention that were previously at the margin, at the periphery, at the outer part of a personality, all of a sudden come to a place of central focus, and other parts have been pushed out. And what does the Bible say about this? The Bible says, what I used to love, I now hate, and what I used to hate, I now love. This is conversion. This is the simplest way to put conversion. And what's funny here is conversion is not always toward the religious impulse. There's a lot of examples in the book where people move from a religious center of attention to a totally atheist center of attention. Like it kind of just depends on the person. Also, conversion, we like to romanticize conversion as this thing that is super sudden and it's seismic and it's dramatic, right? But that's not always the case. A lot of times conversion can be a very gradual thing. A lot of times we ask people, so when did you convert, or what was like the defining moment? There's not always a defining moment. In my own case, I actually used to struggle with this idea that like I can't actually pinpoint one certain point in time where religion actually started to really matter to me. I cannot pinpoint a certain point in time where I like really felt like, oh man, I never had like a road to Damascus moments of like a vision, It was kind of just a gradual process of like learning that some like these certain values are more important to me than all the things that I kind of previously saw as valuable. And the thing that comes with conversion and the real effect that conversion has on a personality is it seems to almost come from without. It seems to not necessarily arise from anything that the individual can explain. And also, it gives the personality a certain strength of resolve that was not previously within the personality. So whereas a person who used to be helplessly addicted to, intercourse, all of a sudden they have extreme strength of character in being able to abstain from intercourse, right? And this is true for all sorts of addictions. People always quote, their conversion to Christianity as the thing that broke their addiction. Jesus helped me break my addiction, all this. And so it conveys a certain, or it gives a certain, why do I keep saying certain? It gives a strength of character that was not previously there, a resolve to do what was previously thought unthinkable. And so, in light of this, James continues the book by sort of analyzing the fruits of various religions. And what do fruits mean? In the Bible, it says, you know a tree by its fruits. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. And what it means is it's speaking to belief, right? So if a person believes in what is good, then they'll bear good fruit. But if they believe in what's not good or what's untrue, then they're going to bear the fruits of that, right? It's, you reap what you sow. That's another common cliche that conveys the same idea. And so what does a given belief or experience cause the saint to do? Usually to pray, to give alms, to fast from certain foods or actions, to voluntarily assume poverty, to accept mistreatment happily. This is kind of a consistent theme throughout religions. The most extreme expression of these types is found within mystics who, have direct experiences of what they perceive to be the divine or ultimate reality, or Brahma, as it's called a lot of times in Hinduism. The comparison of these mystical experiences and the fruits of the saints of these various traditions is where the book begins to take a very perennialist stance. So, for those of you who are a bit more dogmatic, this might be where you take issue with the book, right? And this is, I had heard this going into the book, that this was going to be kind of a central focus of the book, is the perennialist view of religion. Perennialism, for those of you who may not know, is the belief in a sort of unknown skeleton religion that is hiding behind all of the masks of the world religions, right? That all these religions are essentially incomplete expressions of this one kind of secret religion that's been lost to time. All religions are a path to God is a sort of common sentiment that a lot of different religious people have post-Vatican II. And even among a lot of the Neoplatonists or Gnostics, New Agers, Hindus, Sikhs, they kind of have this sort of sentiment that like, oh yeah, it's all one mountain. We're all, the peak is the same, but we're all climbing up different sides of the mountain. This is a very popular view now, this whole perennialist view. So keep that word perennialism in your mind. It's going to be very important going forward. So now that we've made an existential judgment of these religious experiences, we can begin to look at the value of them. That was James's whole purpose of the work, right? Was to get to this point. And so he begins to conclude by the end of the work that there must be some core among all of these religious experiences, of which we can be certain without risking overbelief, which is his word that he uses for things like dogma or institutions of religion. Yeah, there has to be some core, right? There has got to be something in between all these, right? So that we're not risking overbelief. James insists we cannot arrive dogmatically at any one expression of religion through rationality or philosophy alone, right? He pretty much says this is totally impossible. I cannot reason my way to the true religion. And this is kind of echoed by Kierkegaard a little bit in his, I forget which work exactly it is, but he essentially talks about this in his concept of the leap of faith, right? there is a certain bridge between faith and reason that can't be closed. At some point, you will have to take the leap of faith. You cannot totally reason your way to God. That's not to say reason is totally disconnected from religion or that it's not a useful tool for belief, but it's not going to get you there alone. And there's an interesting story. Alex Hormozy, of all people, he's like a business guru. He has a video online where he actually talks about his personal kind of wrestling with Christianity and trying to go to all the apologetic sources and try to figure out what the truth is. Is this true or not? Let me look at the archaeology data. At the end of the day, it's impossible. You cannot, through reason alone, come to faith. And so James insists that we can't arrive dogmatically at any one expression of religion through rationality. So he's essentially saying dogma is useless. He's dogmatically asserting that dogma is useless and that there's no place for dogma. And so therefore, to try and dogmatize the nature of God, like all these religions do, this is totally disconnected from real world practice, as he says. So he thinks that there's no real value in trying to ascertain the nature of God or explain God through philosophy or anything like that. Because in a lot of the religions we have these attempts to systematize theology and explain the essence of God, or to explain, what God is made up of. And he essentially says, if we're going to talk about God as an absolute divine simplicity, or we're going to talk about, God's essence or anything like that, what does that actually have to do with my everyday life? What does that have to do with how I'm going to live my life? This has no effect on the fruits of my, this sort of abstract theologizing is not fruitful, is what he says, which I would personally disagree, only because of my personal study into different religious systems. It is true that to the average person, things like the essence-energy distinction, or the talking about the nature and the persons of God, or the relation between the persons in the Trinity, that these things seem abstract. They seem like something that wouldn't have any effect on our everyday experience. However, I've studied Eastern Orthodox theology for a little bit of time now, and one thing that I noticed is, because the Eastern Orthodox have a different view of the Trinity than, say, the Catholics or the Protestants, it results in a very different sort of theology. And mainly because what is very abstract at the top of the stream, once it flows down, by the time it gets down to here, to like everyday action, or like how I relate to God or how I think about God, a very small change in degree of my direction, it's going to, over time, produce a vastly different end point for things. And so I disagree with him on this point, that theology is not relevant to everyday life. But he essentially says the only real value seems to be the value of a hypothesis. So a religion is mostly valuable because it's hypothesizing in one direction or another. Christianity is hypothesizing one set of dogmas and one set of ways of being, and Hinduism is hypothesizing another, and they're all picking up where science left off. And that's the real value, is that they're making the jump in all these different directions. And so he argues that the book of Job is against any sort of overreaching attempt to create theological formulations. What do I mean by that? So in Job is essentially a servant of God who is the subject of a sort of divine bet, a divine wager between God and Satan, where Satan says, Job only follows you, God, because you are so kind to him. If he were not blessed, then he would curse you, he would forsake you, all this stuff. And so God says, okay, fine, I'll hand Job over to you just to show you that he is loyal to me and that he does love me, not only for the gifts that he's been given, but just because he loves me. And so then Job, obviously, he loses everything. right? He loses his family, he loses his property, he loses his health, he loses everything. Finally, his wife comes to him and says, Job, just why are you still hanging on to God? Why are you still hanging on to your religion? Just curse God and die. That's what Job's wife says. And Job is like, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And then his friends come to him. His friends are theologians. And they say, oh, well, Job, it's because you did this. It's because you haven't admitted your sin. It's because of X, Y, and Z. And James seems to think that the point of the book of Job is to confound this impulse in man to try and theologize about everything and have the answers for everything and to know the judgments and the will of God infallibly. And I kind of agree that that's the point of the book of Job, that it is sort of, it's anti-theology, but not entirely, right? Because Job, you could say, is also himself theologizing. But it's anti this attempt to find answers for everything, like Job's friends. And so I see here the work's limitations, right? This is where I begin to see the limits of Mr. James's Varieties of Religious Experience. And so we're going to get into that now. So because the work primarily focuses on individual experiences and is trying to sort of string them together into a single core religious idea, sentiment, the problem is the author, and even he admits this, is being very intentionally vague and shallow in his citations. So he'll jump from excerpts from Jesuits to Puritans, to Hindus, to mind cure types, to Unitarians, to atheists, to all sorts of believers of radically different theologies. And from there, he'll quote their conversions and mystical experiences into what appears at first glance to be a very harmonious string of pearls that support his viewpoint. And they all seem to point to this kind of monistic idea. And monism, for those of you who don't know, monism is this idea that there's only God, right? There's only God. We're all part of God. We are God. And monism is this idea that there's only the monad. There's only the one. There's not the many. And so a lot of these experiences kind of get conflated into one kind of monistic interpretation, where you have these mystics who are saying, I felt myself transgulfed into the effluence of the all one almighty, and I was him and he was me. And that's what a lot of these kind of get conflated into. And they sound very monistic, and they sound like they're all part of one kind of core type of experience, except the context of these experiences has to be largely ignored. Because if William James were to dig into the individual theologies of these people and the dogmas of these people, we would clearly begin to see that even though they're all referring to God, or they're referring to reality or things like this, or being, they have separate reference. They're not referencing the same God. They're not referencing the same understanding of reality. And so to me, it's like a bait and switch. Like, he's kind of being intentionally vague so he can make his point, but you have to ignore the fundamental differences in these religions to reach this conclusion, this perennialist conclusion. And the fact that all religious experiences can almost universally be classified as belief in an unseen order, and that the general solution is, something's wrong with us and we need to have a correct relation to the divine, that's all well and good. But that does not therefore mean that all the religions are inaccurately referencing the same thing when they talk about God or being or sin or any of these things. And so the argument that the fruits are the same across these religions is not necessarily correct to my view. And throughout the book, there is an overemphasis on the fruits that we can see, right? So he's saying, let's judge the fruits of these people. But in reality, we have no idea. We have a subjective view of what the value of these fruits are, right? because we're seeing men do good things, right? We're seeing men give to charity. We're seeing men pray a lot. We're seeing these people do things that objectively, it's like, oh yeah, these seem like good fruits. I bet these are good fruits. I bet God's happy with this. But, they may appear as good fruits, but to God, they may be repulsive. God might hate these things. And the reason why is because, in the Bible, we see in the case of the Pharisees, they're doing things that to men seem very righteous, right? It seems very righteous to men. Men look at them and say, oh yeah, they seem to have good fruits, I guess. They seem really religious. But then obviously God says that they are whitewashed tombs with dead men's bones inside of them. So they look good on the outside, but they're inwardly very repulsive to God. And so that's kind of one of the problems we see here is he's not willing to dogmatically assert anything except the claim that we can't dogmatically assert anything. And also, we're going to judge all these religions based on their fruits. But actually, I don't even know if we can necessarily judge fruits. We're told to judge fruits so we can know what ideology is good or bad. But also, these things ultimately, in the final analysis, the meaning of these things, or the value of these things, cannot be effectively determined by man or by science. And even though he says, we're not going to use science to come to a value judgment about these things, he absolutely does. He's absolutely using science as the framework with which he's going to try to analyze the fruits of these things. Because a lot of how he values saintly actions comes down to how useful they are to the people around you. Except, what if that's not necessarily the main core metric that these things are being judged on? Of course, men are going to judge actions based on how useful they are to other men, but that might not be the objective sort of criteria. And so he asserts that through philosophy and science, we should eventually come to a point where religion, with religion, where we're able to eliminate doctrines that are now known to be scientifically absurd or incongruous. So his hope is that a science of religion of this sort will develop to a point where even the personally non-religious might accept its conclusions on trust, which sounds promising, right? It sounds like what Sam Harris talks about. Sam Harris is like, we just need to develop a kind of scientific view of morality where we mostly determine things based on human flourishing and what does he call it? Well-being. It's so subjective, and it's just you're just making it up as you go. And so, if we were to create some sort of belief system like this, it would appear to be quite the invention. A system of belief that answers the questions that religion has always attempted to answer, without the requirement of moral dogmas or faith in something unseen. This would appear to be something quite miraculous and, very, very compatible with man's kind of this worldly desires. And matter of fact, there's a book by Seraphim Rose called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, where he talks about just such a project. And this project is actually underway. Did you know they are in the process of developing a sort of religion, a way of acting in the world, and a way of being that is kind of scientifically determined. It requires no faith. It doesn't place any strict moral strictures on people, and it's determined by science. That's great. Elon Musk actually, he tweeted recently and he said, we need to have a religion of the future where it's not dogmatic. You don't have to have faith in things unseen, but it still gives people a clear purpose and a clear meaning and all this stuff. And so obviously Seraphim Rose's prediction is already well underway. And this religion of the future, it might actually be a lot more sinister than any of us are presently able to comprehend. Why should we presuppose science over religion? Why is science what we need to go to over religion? Because we stated earlier, science is not necessarily able to answer the religion or answer the questions that religion is seeking to answer, right? I think we have a type much like Fraser. in William James. Like I said, I think he's a little bit more self-aware, but not all the way. So he's interested in the utility of religion, but his faith in the objectivity of science is totally unshakable. And one of the most resonant points of the work comes at the very end. James states that the aesthetic appeal of a religion plays into its being chosen. So a man who really loves ritual, he might be more likely to be a Catholic. A man who enjoys simplicity and kind of less restraint on his everyday action, he might choose to be kind of a progressive Christian. You know, he doesn't want to have to worry about all these like moral oughts and stuff. And so the aesthetic appeal of a religion has a lot to do with how it's chosen or if it's chosen. And I totally agree. I don't think we can ever ignore the personality of a person when we are evaluating his choice of religion or his choice of philosophy for that matter. Even Nietzsche says this. So Nietzsche says that the personality of a philosopher can never be ignored when you are considering his philosophy. Carl Jung, to take this even further, said that the philosopher, even when he is attempting to be purely objective in his view of the world, is only ever capable of articulating in a very splendid fashion his own particular neuroses, his own particular pathologies. Kierkegaard, he knew that to try and reason oneself to faith is a fool's errand, and a certain leap of faith is always going to be required. I said that earlier. James, in his book, he at least admits that a natural religion derived from reason is impossible, and it's kind of a hopeless project, right? Because it's dead on arrival. Because, you know, if we were able to come up with some sort of skeleton religion that everyone is able to follow, by its very fact of being rationally or scientifically determined, it would lose that kind of mystical sense, right? That kind of makes people believe in things. And the true vital relationship with the object of worship would kind of be lost in such a method. And so for James, the use of religion remains thus. Man becomes conscious that his higher part is coterminous and continuous with a more of the same quality, which is operative in the universe outside of him and which he can keep in working touch with, and in a fashion get on board of and save himself when all his lower being has gone to pieces in the wreck. And so while I am not opposed to his charge of what the general nucleus of all religion is, to essentially become like the object of worship, that seems to be what's consistent across all of these. It's you worship something, you place something at the hierarchy of values at the very topmost part, and then you become in the image of this thing. I agree with that. But we have not, through his effort, come to any closer. Through his work, we really haven't come any closer to determining what the correct object of worship ought to be, right? You can't get an ought from an is. And so he's essentially saying, yeah, well, you become more like the object of worship. And he even says that it's perhaps not right that all men at all times should all have the same religion. Maybe certain religions serve other people better. You know, maybe one religion is good for a man somewhere and another religion is good for another man somewhere else. And so essentially we come down to the point where we can't ascertain like what the object of worship should be or ought to be. It's impossible in his project. And so to say it's subjective, as he states in his work, it's kind of a self-defeating position. You're saying what we ought to worship is totally subjective, but is that statement itself subjective or is it objective? Because if it's objective, well, then we actually can know objectively what we should worship. If it's subjective, then the statement is self-refuting. It doesn't make any sense. He says that, oh yeah, I already went over this. And so he obviously avoids the question of God's character, right? We can't know God's character according to James. And also he says that it's irrelevant. Like he just outright says it's irrelevant for us to try and consider what God is like or how to understand him or anything like that. All that's irrelevant. What matters for James is that the God we choose is one that is of some utility to us on our journey. It sounds a lot like Jordan Peterson, doesn't it? It sounds a lot like Jordan Peterson, where God is kind of just this like kind of self-help idea, right? It helps you become more self-actualized and stuff. And so a quote from James, and this is where I'll leave off. Not God, but life, more life, a larger, richer, more satisfying life is, in the last analysis, the end of religion. Surely I am not alone in wondering, is this a Freudian slip or a double entendre?